Welcome to another episode of the Confidence in Conflict podcast, your destination for learning how to prevent and better manage conflict in both your professional and personal lives. This is Alan Olschlager again. We are deep into the holiday season here in Milwaukee, but it certainly feels different than past Decembers, I'll tell you. For you football fans, what doesn't feel different is having the Packers leading the NFC North Division. We're 9-3, and the Vikings are next in line, way behind us with a 6-6 record. Anyway, this episode is the second in our series about intra-organizational conflict. In this episode, I speak with Dr. Jim Bone, who has been on the front lines of this issue for his entire career. I think you're going to get just getting some great insights about this universal issue within organizations. So let's get started. Well, good morning, Jim. Great to have you back on our show. Thanks so much for participating here on a Saturday morning in Wisconsin.
It's always great to talk with you, Al. I always enjoy our conversations together.
Yeah, well, this will be a fun one. So, why don't you, rather than me trying, why don't you introduce yourself so everybody knows your background and where you're from and whatever, and then we'll get into our topic.
Sounds great. Yeah, my name is Dr. Jim Bone. I have an earned doctorate from the University of Wisconsin. My research skill is in organizational analysis. My specialties are change management and leadership development. Um, Also, along with that, I have taught in multiple universities in the Southeast Wisconsin area. Worked in a Fortune 100 company for 33 years. That would be Johnson Controls. And also opened up my own consulting organization, which is proaxios.llc. I've written 4 different books in the area of change management, IT change, organizational engagement, which is a complement to employee engagement, and a book called Nuts and Bolts of Leadership. So I have a dense background over 4 decades of working with literally hundreds of leaders and thousands of people in multiple different ranges of markets, ranging from oil and gas to banking to retail to telecommunications. So I don't want to say I've seen it all, but I've seen a whole lot.
Exactly. And I think we did talk, Jim, about how when you go from organization to organization, this was early in my career. There was a guy from General Electric who came to our organization, and I was a new guy coming out of business school. And he goes, Al, you're going to have a long career, and I'll just give you one little piece of advice. He goes, nothing changes but the part numbers. Right? And it's so true. I'm sure you've seen the same stuff over and over and over again, no matter what organization you've worked with. So
I had a friend who used to say, the bodies have been moved, but the tombstones are in the same place.
there we go. Yeah. So, but just give that one example you shared with me about how uh, when you're with Johnson Controls on how you would go into an organization and people's jobs would change like pretty dramatically. So just share that so people can get a sense for how big a changes you dealt with.
Do you mind if I use a different one?
Yep, that's fine. Yep, yep.
But well, the one Al was referring to was in big pharma, and the work that we did had to do with what we called facilities management, and essentially what would happen is people's jobs would move from their organization into Johnson Controls. But the one I want to share with you today is a little bit more relevant, I think, to the subject that we're talking about, and that is the hardest change process that I ever did, which was standardizing uniforms for 5,000 people. Now, that may sound very mundane and very boring. It may sound like, well, all you do is just tell them what to wear tomorrow. But the reality is that is extremely complicated because when you're talking about people's attire, when you're talking about their clothing, you're one step away from the thing that is most valuable to them in the workplace, of course, which is their pay. So that was one very, very complicated change process. And I just recall a vice president walking past me in the hall saying, "Can you get those uniforms standardized in a couple of weeks?" And I took a breath and walked back, and I said, "No, this is going to take a little longer than that." for us to do this right. I mean, we can force anything, but to get this to really be adjusted and adapted, we're going to have to do some work. So anyway, real quick story on that one. Of course, there are people out in the field who were very, very frustrated about the idea at all. So one of the most important things you can do in change is engage the people who are rejecting the idea. And so what I did is I contacted one guy out in Oregon and I said, "What do you think about this?" Of course, he was very brusque and, "Well, this is never going to work." I said, "I'll tell you what, we'll send you a couple of different versions of this." And the funniest thing happened. He ended up putting one of the shirts on his dog and having
Oh,
a dog roll around in the dirt and run around for the weekend to test the shirt if it would hold up. And then we used him as an exemplar on our conference call to have him talk about what he did with his dog. And it was a great way to get people to adjust to the new idea. But we surveyed almost 1,000 people. We got their responses. It sounded really simple, but it's by far the hardest change that I ever conducted.
very, very interesting. Yeah, yeah. It's yeah. It was a few years back, but I remember I talked to an attorney who had had been in private practice and then joined an organization, and he said the biggest issue that he's seen is who got to sit next to a window,
Yep.
right? And if you move somebody into a different cubicle or office that didn't have a window, it was like you just couldn't be any worse, right?
Well, the interesting thing about that is that really sets the table on the subject that we're talking about. It's many times those mundane issues that tend to spur on bigger issues and bigger problems. So that's the subject we'll be talking about. But I'm more than delighted to say that one other issue that I faced was two teams had been in the same building, and they were forced to move. One team was forced to move across the street, and I remember one team saying to me, "That road has now become the greatest obstacle to our progress."
Wow. Yeah, yeah. Well, so people who've been listening to this podcast know that I work with Vistalar, and we are a conflict management training company. However, what we normally focus on are working with contact professionals, meaning anybody that's dealing with either their clients or with the general public for most of their day. So that would be obviously police officers, teachers, healthcare workers, parking, officers that are dealing with parking tickets, uh, casino workers, right? Hospitality workers, transit workers, anybody that's dealing with the public or their clients regularly. Salespeople are in that category. But usually those interactions are fairly brief, right? It's a few minutes, maybe 30 minutes, the length of a flight, whatever. And then you might never see that person again.
Right. Yeah.
And what we want to talk about here is something we've been working on for a while. We're not there yet, but we want to expand our market into what I describe as intra-organizational conflict, meaning
Hmm.
people that are, and it's the examples we've already shared here, but it's where the people within the organization are either dealing with their boss, they're dealing with an employee, they're dealing with different departments, they're interacting on issues related to budget, whatever, where it's inside the organization and conflict obviously arises there and it creates all kinds of problems. And Jim, you've had probably as much experience with this as almost anybody on the planet. So I just thought it'd be great to have a conversation. We're in the process of putting this program together. You're going to help us with that in as we move forward. But I just thought we'd talk through what those issues look like and get some of your insights on how to deal with them.
Yeah, I'm really, really pleased to hear that someone's actually taking this on. I think, Al, your organization may be one of the few that is actually looking into something bigger than just the local stuff. And I know you guys are experts at the local stuff, and I have high respect for that. But intra-organizational conflict, it starts with something as simple as maybe even a 4 or 5 person team. Then it can move up to divisional conflict between teams and organizations. And what I mean by that is whether it's HR, legal, manufacturing, production and sales, operations and sales is a historical area for ongoing conflict for obvious reasons. And then it can go into even higher levels where you have one product division that is working against another product division where there's competition that's built in for good reasons, which is to quote unquote bring the cream of the crop to the top. But because of the notions of competition between groups and the notions of having to get things done, very, very often people forget one crucial thing when they're working with an organization, and that is this. No matter how big the organization is, and I could name some marquee companies here, but I won't. I'm talking about multi-billion-dollar companies. There's only so much to go around.
Yep.
And what I mean by that, yeah, I know you know, but whether it's money, whether it's retail facilities, or even like a window, like you talked about, whether it's leadership competence, because you know that there's limits to that, limits to the amount of people you have, limits to the staff. You have to put in your mind a box that says no matter how big this company is, the market cap is still $8.6 billion, and that's it for today. It may go up a little bit, but you know what I'm talking about. And so that's the beginning of all organizational conflict, because ultimately it reduces down into different groups, different divisions, and different teams, ultimately even down into small teams, because someone's going to ask the question, who is getting what and why? And that is sort of a perennial question across human nature, that sort of thing. So there's a pretty deep issue there about the notion of organizations only have so much to go around. So that's a starting point. That can breed conflict any day of the week. I mean, if you have 12 windows and you've got 14 people, somebody's not going to get that window. And so that comes into the next issue of
But
just.
Jim, let me jump in and just make just you're reminding me of I was clearly involved with that. A big corporation, actually big pharma, and every year we did the annual business plan. And because they wanted to use a good process, so everybody contribute. We built it up from the ground up. Yada yada. Here's what I want to do. Whatever. Got up to the highest levels. It was always way more money than anybody had to spend, right? So then it became the whole process. Okay, now we're going to whittle it down. Well, that's where the conflict occurred, right? And I remember we had a vice president of engineering, just brilliant guy, but he said, he goes, I don't understand why we just don't say right up front that 15% of our budget is going to engineering. Boom, go figure it out. And I'm sure there's organizations that work that way, but because we wanted to, get everybody participating, it was no, we're going to build it up from the ground up, make sure you know what projects you're going to do, and let's, forecast out. And but it was always a mess at the end because it was always, like twice as much money as we had to spend.
And again, that presents a bunch of new problems along the way, like you've got too much money, and now what are we going to do with the excess and so forth. So what I want to do is just take that broader sort of umbrella notion of there's limits in an organization and put the other side of the tension out there, which is human motivation. People come to work for a lot of reasons. I mean, primarily they come to work, I believe, I'm trying to think of, there was a very famous actor that said, I act so that I can do the things that I want to do. And I'm trying, it'll come to me in a while. But there are some very fundamental human motivations that we don't talk about a lot, but these are the ones that drive conflict, and they are as follows. Number one is competence. Number one is competence. Are people in my team competent? Can they do the job? Or are they incompetent? Am I picking up the slack for them? So just think about that one. The second one is autonomy. Autonomy is by the way, there's research behind all this stuff. I'm not going to bore you with those details, but autonomy is literally the history of the human race. It's who's going to be free to do something, who's not going to be free, who's going to resist being oppressed, who's going to rise up against it. Now, in organizations, when we talk about that stuff, of course, we're much more polished in our speech, but the reality is everyone in an organization wants to have a voice, and that's becoming more and more prominent. It started probably in the 90s, but in the times we live in now, especially with the power of LinkedIn and some other social media, having a voice has become almost a rallying cry for any employee, that their ideas and their concepts should be brought forth and admired and such. And if you say that's not going to happen, now you're starting another a spark of conflict because, well, I wasn't respected. I don't give the freedom to have a voice and so forth. That's a really big one.
Yep. Yep.
Go ahead.
No, just say 100%. Every time we talk, my brain goes back to my corporate life, and it just kind of, I go, yeah, 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 yeah. I mean, it's just universal. But go ahead.
What's interesting about that, Al, is you and I have some rather storied careers. We've been with a lot of different people, but these same issues, even if they're 4 or 5 decades old, keep coming up because, again, I'll say that human nature is consistent across time. A third real important motivation for people is the notion of relationships. People have friends in the workplace or relationships that they like to have because it gives them some meaning. So if you tweak with those relationships and you move Joe Smith next to Ann, who he doesn't like, that's going to start to create conflict. And this stuff just happens naturally as you assemble teams. I'm sure that in your career, you had times where somebody said, "Al, you're going to work for Jim Bowen," and you're going, "Oh my God, the guy's a tyrant. I don't want to work there." But you're forced into this relationship circumstance, which again, so you've got competence, autonomy, relationships, which can be good or bad. Then you've got issues, a real powerful one, which we don't hear unless we ask a person, "What do you want to do with your life?" And they say the following statement: "Is I want to make a difference."
Yeah.
And that goes back to around 1958. There was a researcher called White who came up with this concept that you don't hear very often. It's called effectance motivation. It's the idea of I want to make a difference. I want to know that I mattered. And even little kids have this. They want to know that they mattered, that they're important. So if you start tweaking with that, any of those four motivations, and I can talk about efficacy and some other stuff along the way, but if you tweak with any of those, you're going to start getting into the reasons that people come to work, and that's going to cause some problems along the way. Now,
And Jim, tell me, I got to get this down. So the make a difference motivation is called what?
effectance, Effectance. The researcher's name was White, White. I can't remember his first name.
No, I love it because I've never heard that term before used in that way. I've heard effective, not effectance, but it makes all kinds of sense, and you're 100% right. And with all these, just as you're talking, is there? It seems like, and you made some reference to it, that with this, and I know they hate to be called millennials, but the millennials have in some of these actually more of a motivation along these lines. Is there some validity to that or not?
I would say it's the relationship piece and the autonomy piece is really, really big. And the autonomy piece, I could go into a whole soliloquy on that. I'm not going to do, but if you think about uh, as you and I were growing up, the notion of autonomy was somewhat limited, even by the way that our parents acted coming out of World War I, World War II, Korea, and so forth.
Yep.
That has changed dramatically. And so the notion of autonomy and freedom and my voice, that's a really, really big deal in the millennial workforce.
Yep. Heard
So,
that. Okay.
so I want to lay one more thing down before I start talking about some things that we can do to change this and to do it well. Um, the issues of power, turf, and fear. Those three issues, and I know you bump into this in the workshops that you do. You're doing this just one-on-one, but the issues of power. Who is going to be controlling resources? That's power.
Yep.
And if you're interested in whether or not that's an important subject, you can contact Jeffrey Pfeffer. He's a Harvard business professor who spent his whole life studying the concept of power. And he says things like, it's not a question of whether or not there will be power, because it will be, but it's a question of how we will use it. And it can be used for good, and it can be. There's issues of turf. And the place that you find this in interorganizational conflict is when people have data, for example, that they don't want to share with other people because it might reveal, number one, that somebody was hoarding some information that's important, or because it keeps those people in business. I've met people who've had spreadsheets they protected with multiple passwords because they didn't want anybody to know the cross references for part numbers and so forth, because
Yep.
they were the ones that knew it, and that protected their job. So there's a turf element there. And then of course the last thing that causes problems in organizations is fear, and that goes in the whole change management business and what we do to manage anxiety. So those are some of the things that are important in this subject matter. And again, I could spend a lot more time on every one of them individually, but I think for today, the key to fixing some of these intra-organizational conflicts is it takes effort. That's just the top thing I would say is it takes effort to manage intra-organizational conflicts. And I'm not just talking about some kumbaya speech where we just say we're going to work together better.
Right, exactly.
Well, and again, you've noticed that. You've seen these. You go down the hall. We're going to be great together, and two doors down, people are fighting and screaming. So there's an element of being careful not to give employees rah-rah speeches without giving them some substance behind it, because people are very, very smart about those things. But so what it takes is a leadership determination and leadership effort to say, all right, we're going to make things work together. What that entails very often is getting a team of people together around a common project. And let me say that again. The greatest successes I've seen in getting people to work together is bringing them together around a common project. Something that they all can celebrate together when they win. Something where they all can stand on top of the mountain and say, we did this together. Those things tend to build a great deal of camaraderie and cohesion and collaboration in organizations. So the first thing I would say is that it's effortful leadership to say we're going to work on this together, and that means the executives themselves need to be roll up their sleeves and stay in the fray. I can think of one particular merger and acquisition I was involved in. It was massive. I mean, bigger than most people can imagine. We had a 50-person team from all over the company, different people, different groups, different divisions, and we worked like crazy to do this merger and acquisition, and we worked with a company that was being acquired, and we had a spectacular team. But it was led by a guy who determined that we were going to work together. He kept a sense of humor, but a sense of expectation, a sense of this is what we're trying to accomplish. He kept a common sense of measuring progress so we knew what we were doing, and brought the right people together and got rid of people that weren't working and on things like that. So that notion of having, and this really fits in human nature as well. When people are either aligned against a common enemy, for example, in a war, or they're aligned in a common goal to accomplish something together, like on a sports team, the amount of extra motivational power you get from that is just incredible. So
You know,
that,
Jim,
go
Jim,
ahead.
again, you're bringing back memories. So I was involved, as you know, in the medical device business back in the mid 80s. And
Yep.
this when total quality management was a big deal. Deming was red hot. You know, the auto industry was going through a transformation. We brought in, I don't know if you know Clark and Wheelwright. Do you know those names?
The name is familiar. I can't say that I worked with them, but the name is familiar.
Yeah, so Clark, I think, was from Stanford, and Wheelwright was from Harvard, one of the two, and they had gone over to Japan to learn how they made cars, and
Okay.
came back, and so they were, they were all about Deming and all that stuff. But anyway, we at the company I was with hired a total quality management company to come in and embed themselves in our organization. It was called Performance Excellence, remember? And and this was, I never thought of it in these terms, but one of their biggest thing were these cross-functional teams focused on a problem,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it was let's first figure out what the big problems are in the company, right? Let's get, it's the 8-step problem solving approach, where the first step is make sure you know what the problem is. And then they put a team together, cross-functional, and they gave them time then to go work that problem. And I always thought of it in terms of total quality management and whatever, but what you're saying is that probably had a secondary goal of just getting better teamwork going and less conflict.
And also and it happens because of a couple things. The funny thing is when Al starts to learn what Jim actually does, it's like, wow, that's you develop a little bit of respect for the fact that maybe I've got a skill in an area that you don't. And the other thing is, which is even more fundamental, Al, which helps to to remove some of the fear issues. I got to tell you a funny story. I worked with one large company up in Minneapolis. I won't name the company, but you can probably figure out who they were. And I remember when I was up there, I said, we need to get somebody from purchasing to come and talk about this particular thing. And I was in the engineering, working with the engineering group, and we got this purchasing guy to come down. It was one floor down, one floor down. And, and he said, I've never met you, and I've been here for 20 years.
How many
So
times have we heard that? Yeah.
I know it's so funny, but the reality is that very often we're afraid of people that we haven't met. This goes back to all kinds of things that you and I could spend a lot of time on. But, the more you get to know somebody, the more you realize, they're just another human being like you are. They're trying to get stuff done. And when you work with them face to face, as opposed through email, like you said, in a cross-functional team, all of a sudden, you may not like everything about them. They may have tuna sandwiches for lunch that you don't particularly like, but you come to find out they're a brilliant engineer or a brilliant HR person that can help get things done, or they're a finance person that caught something, and respect develops. All of those things are byproducts of having people work together on one thing, and it's a whole hell of a lot of fun. When we did with this merger we did in 6 months, we had to hit the cooling season, and my God, it was like people had just they won the World Series. I mean, it was amazing because we worked together. Now, that's not to say we didn't have some quirky issues along the way and people get frustrated, but those things are more done at the level of conflict you're talking about, those one-on-one things. The getting people to work together around a common goal is psychologically powerful across time. It's
Love
just,
it.
yeah, so it's something that's
Never thought of it in those terms. And have you had any interaction or know much about Michael Cudahy and his work at Market Electronics?
I mean, I've met him several times, and I worked with him on a couple of projects that were more nonprofit and beneficial. But
Yeah, that
I
makes
know a little bit about him. He's a very interesting dude.
so quite a maverick, and started Marquette back in the '70s. I was there in the early '90s,
Yeah.
but I was, he was, in my opinion, way ahead of his time. But when I was there, and I haven't seen this in any other company, I'm curious if you have. We had probably in the building. It was down on whatever I forgot the street they were on, but anyway, in Milwaukee here. But they had Tower Avenue, sorry, and they had, I'm guessing 800 people in the building, probably. And there was a wall down a hall where he required that every single employee had a big picture of themselves, not just some little thumbnail, but a big picture on this long wall where you could go and see the person's name. That was all in alphabetical order. You could find the person, find out what department they were in, and see their picture on this wall. And it was, I mean, just a silly little thing, but it dealt with some of what you're describing there. I mean, it was you'd say, oh yeah, well, there's John Smith over in purchasing. Well, let me go before I go meet with you. Let me go look at his picture. Oh yeah, I've seen John. Oh yeah, John was at the event. Oh yeah, I even talked to John at the last, get together, whatever. It was a big deal. And it was, I don't know, I've never seen another company do it.
Well, I've seen some companies do it, but I don't think they did it as well as him. And I think part of it was he was a very ironic, fun guy to be around, very energetic. And so if he thought this was a great idea, people were going to follow that. So you're moving me right into the next element of what I suggest that we talk about as far as resolving conflict. So nice to put the ball on the tee. Leadership is one of those hackneyed, overused words that candidly almost drives me nuts. Sometimes I look at it on LinkedIn, there's somebody writing a new leadership book every day, and then executives go through an airport and they pick up a book, read it, and they turn their whole company upside down. But the hardball leadership, day-to-day leadership, really makes a difference when it comes to this stuff. And I've seen people in top levels of organizations come down to a level of just plain speech, no corporate talk, getting together with people in cafeterias, meeting them in lunchrooms, meeting them after work. Um, and because of the skill sets that they had, not only interpersonally, but also because of their competence. I mean, I know people are so smart, it's just ridiculous. but
Yep.
they also were able to candidly just be part of working with people on a great level. And when those kinds of people come into a team and they set an expectation for teams to work together, people know that this is not just, more stuff that's written on a wall or a PowerPoint slide. They know this person, he or she really does mean to have a white hot team.
Yep.
It just at the risk of personal blathering, I always told teams that I came into in the beginning, even some very, very difficult ones as a designated hitter, I said, we will have a white hot team within 2 years, and we're going to do great things in this company, and we're going to do them together. Now, I had to back up my words with that. I
Right.
had,
Right.
I had to do that with things like taking care of their pay, making sure that people were properly recognized for the work that they did and so forth. But when you're talking about intra-organizational conflict, nothing does a better job of fixing that than someone who's engaged in the broader process. And the one boss, I wish I could use his name, but I won't, but that just emulated this so much was just, he was all about getting the job done. He
Yeah.
just reminded me so much of my dad, who was a blue collar guy, couldn't even write, but John was brilliant, but John had a Harvard education. I mean, he was the top dog, and yet he just was all about, let's get the job done. And he wouldn't countenance things like gossiping. He wouldn't countenance things like, let's draw out some old story. I mean, he would call people on old news very quickly and say, what are we going to do to get the job done? And eventually, what happens when people hear that, they realize that that leader really is about getting the job done. They're not there to carry a grudge. They're not there to which I'll talk about in a minute. They're not there to cause people hardship. They're just here to say, okay, you're on my team. We're working together. We want to accomplish this big thing. How can I help you do that? And what are we doing to get the job done? And at a very baseline level, I'm talking with mechanics and getting in trucks and
Yep.
all that kind of stuff makes a dramatic difference in solving team conflict. Conversely, let me get this point out. Conversely, the leader that consistently talks about how powerful their team is, as opposed to somebody else in the organization, and runs that other team down, all they're doing is adding wood to a fire. And so those are the people that very often are setting up the inter-organizational conflicts that you see. In fact, some of them take pride in it. I wouldn't go so far as to say they're narcissists, although there's probably a percent that are. But it's like, we're going to prove that we're better than anybody else. And as soon as you do that, you're starting to put people in a role where they don't feel respected. And one of Bones' laws is, if you push, people shove. And so the two things I've mentioned so far is having a common goal, and then having leaders who are willing to work with people and drive them toward the goal, and to get away from some of the personality stuff, which by the way, will never be fixed. I mean, there's evidence to that end. So
But
does that make sense so far?
it does. But it's there's such a fine balance between that last point you made, that between saying, okay, on one hand, I want to make sure that my team knows that we're crushing it. We're the best on the planet. We're doing great things for the company. We're making a difference, whatever. And then still not making it look like somehow we're better than everybody else in the company.
Well,
Right? That's
yeah, and yeah, candidly, I think there's a way to do that. I'm just a big fan of letting reputation speak for itself.
yeah.
But within the team, you're always saying, let's do this, let's rock and roll. We're going to be a white hot team. We're going to do great work. We want to be known for something that's big. We want to be respected because people want that. But outside the team, ensuring that we're there to help the company succeed. I always ask executives this one question when I'm in workshops with them: how easy is it to work with you?
Yeah, there we go. Yep.
And if people say, "Oh my God, I never want to work with that guy again," I'm telling you that is a place where conflict will start. I want to take a quick aside here too to mention this notion of one other thing when it comes to human personality and those motivations I talked about before. I always, when I'm in workshops asking people how they're dealing with their teams, I ask them this one question: have you ever been to a class reunion? And they look at me and they kind of laugh. And of course, some have been 10-year, 15-year. I'll be doing my 50-year class reunion next year. and I ask them, what are those people like? And they all say the same thing. They're exactly the same as they were in high school.
Right. Right.
Now, here's the important point. One of the other things that causes conflict in organizations is when Al tries to change Jim into Al. Because Jim and Al are going to be who they are, and it's going to be very constant over time. There's something called a Big Five personality inventory that proves that it's been used across hundreds of thousands of people. But so when organizations try to train people to be different and try to train them to act different, they're missing the point. The point is, let's work toward a common goal. Let's work on that together. And Al may be a little more introverted, Jim may be a little more extroverted, but the common goal is something both of them can approach together. So does that make sense?
It does, and and maybe this is another little aside, but I'm curious in your opinion on this. Is that what you're describing? You're saying, okay, don't you're a manager. You're not going to change that guy that you're working with. I mean, either they shouldn't be in the company, which is obviously another source of conflict, or let's all get focused on the common goal and understand we're bringing strengths and weaknesses to the team, and let's go figure it out. But where do annual performance reviews fall with all that? And you could probably go on for 4 days about that. But what's your opinion about annual performance reviews?
Oh, I know that there's a big push to get rid of them, but I candidly believe that an annual performance review is a very valuable tool if it's done right.
There we go. Yep.
I mean, if it's only a punitive action to bring up all the terrible things Al's done in the past year, don't do it. But if you use a performance review in a good way and let that person bring their achievements forward, bring forward the things that they've accomplished, bring forward how they've benefited the organization, the powerful subcurrent of that is a person gets to go back and do what? Remember, I want to make a difference.
Yeah.
And so they find that out, and the person that's leading them says, man, you really have made a difference this year. And when you think about it, in people's lifetime, they spend a third of their lives at work. They want to know they made a difference. So an annual performance review can do that. Um, if an annual performance review is only to bring up nasty stuff that happened 5 months ago, that's like me and my wife fighting about something that happened 20 years ago. It's just silly, and it goes nowhere. And so if the tricky, hard thing should be addressed immediately, and I'm sure you feel the same way. It's like, you know what,
Yeah.
you stepped out of line. Let's get this done. But the performance review, I think, should be to say, we've accomplished a lot together this year. Let's set some goals. I never saw them as bad things, unless they were just some sort of punitive action to get rid of somebody in an organization. But that's not the way to think about it. And I think that's probably why somebody along the way had a bad performance review, and so they color everything in every performance review I ever have as something bad, and no one has a right to review my performance. But the reality is organizations pay people to do work, and if you're not doing the work, there's always something we can improve on.
Yep.
And the greatest managers I ever had said, you know what, you did all this great stuff. Here's two things I really think you got to work on, Jim.
Yeah. There we go.
And because I respected them and because they had challenged me throughout the year, it's like, you know what? Oh my God, I didn't even think about that. And so I got better. There's one other element to that I touched on it just a little bit, and that's the notion of executives that don't hold grudges. The ones that hold grudges will tend to continually build intra-organizational conflict. And what I mean by that is that if Al doesn't like Jim and we hold on to that grudge, that can just, people know about it. They pick it up. They know it's on the grapevine. But I
Yep.
had one boss one time. I did the terrible, terrible thing with a project I was working on and side skipped a step and caused him some serious, serious pain. I mean, serious pain. And he took me into his office that afternoon and he let me have it. I mean, and he was right. What I
Right.
had done was inexcusable. That night at the Christmas party, he saw me, shook my hand, wished me a Merry Christmas, introduced me to his wife, big smile on his face, like nothing had happened.
We're moving on. Exactly.
We're
Yep.
moving on. Jim, you really screwed up. And it cost me dearly. And you're going to go fix that right now, which I did. But I expected for sure when I saw him that night that I have to hang my head down. It wasn't like that. It was like, no, we've taken care of that. Let's move on. And I think that's a big piece of if you have executives that hold on to those grudges, that builds into organizational conflict too. So the
Well,
last. Go
Just
ahead.
what two quick things. One is I'm sure you've so, and I'm sure you have no data on it, but your question of if performance reviews are done right, I think the big issue here is what percentage of performance reviews are done right. And I think there's a lot that aren't done right. And they do what you're describing. Basically, it's an opportunity to beat somebody up for what they did over the last year and 8 months ago and whatever. But to your other point, is I'm sure you heard the story. I think it's Watson at IBM. I don't know if it's even a true story, but where the guy walks in and he had made some mistake that cost the company $10 million. Have you heard that story? And Watson, he came in expecting to get fired, and Watson said, "Fire you?" Said, "I just spent $10 million training you."
I have heard that. I think that was in Posner and Kouzes in one of their leadership books.
Yeah, yeah.
So I've got one other thing that I think helps to um, resolve these conflicts and bring things toward more normalcy in organizations. And I mean, clearly, right now there's other conflicts that are going on that you know, I'm just going to express this. I think we're so focused now on our differences in organizations, and I'm not going to go into all the details on it. We're so focused on our differences in organizations, especially in HR, that we are losing sight of the things we're doing together. And that's why I would always tell people, I don't care where you came from. I don't care what your background is. I don't care what part of the world you came from, or what your beliefs are, any of that. That's great. That belongs to you. That's what makes your identity. What I'm interested in is you have a skill and you have a persona and you have intelligence that can build this team. That's all I want. That's all we need. And let's focus on that. But I think, again, we're focusing so exclusively, more and more exclusively on these finite slivers of difference that it's really getting harder and harder for people to say, we have things in common as opposed to the things that we have that are different. And that's just sort of an editorial. So
Yep.
I want to give one last bit on this. In the big projects I was talking about, getting people together in a room together and having them talk about the conflict issues that they're facing, it goes a long way for fixing things. And let me tell you about what I mean. One of the IT projects that I was engaged in, there were 35 different teams across an organization that were involved in this. I mean, it was massive, as you can expect. And I know you were involved in some of that stuff too. Everything from data cleansing to the coding to how people are going to get trained to how people are going to get affected. I mean, it was hard. So instead of just letting this sort of free fall and have people get frustrated and start to build the rumor mill and all the rest of that, I got those people into a room at least once a month while we were going through the early parts of the project. Later on, twice a month, where we could raise issues in the presence of each other and facilitate the group, get the issues resolved so that people could walk away and say, okay, now I know what I'm doing. And it's sort of this buildup that needs to get resolved. And once that happens, two things occur. Number one, okay, we know the next step in this. And secondly, it was like, okay, we're going to have a rhythm and routine here where we're going to come back together and talk about this. And maybe we'll get to it earlier. Maybe we need to get to it sooner. But having people know that open communication around conflict issues, whether it's any of the things we've talked about, that really helps a lot. When it comes down to the issues of power and turf and fear, those issues, again, are best addressed one-on-one by leaders working with the people that are manifesting those things. That's different than looking at the, for lack of a better word, the collective per se. But getting people to focus on what we're accomplishing together and ensuring they get a chance to communicate about it, get a chance to even bellyache about it and complain about it and to address it continues to move things forward. I've seen that work, I would say 80 to 85% of the time.
So you might know the source of this. I don't know how many years and years and years ago, I heard some story, probably heard it at a conference or something. Don't know the source, but it was and I'm sure, I don't know who it was, but it was this idea of relative to a team, right? Is form, storm, norm, perform. Are you
Yeah,
familiar?
yes. That is forming. That's forming, storming, norming, performing. What's that guy's name? He came up with it probably in the late '60s. It'll come to me as I'm going along. But he developed it. Yeah, those are the stages of performance in the team. I want to say
Yep.
Hathaway, but that's not the name of it. It does start with an H. It'd come to me later on.
But it's from the '60s. It's that long ago. So yeah,
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
but that's what you're describing here, right? You're getting a team together and you're saying let's performing, right? Then storming is that opportunity to bellyache and communicate and what are our issues and let's work through them. And then you finally get back to okay, now we finally have a chance to get back to normal, where a lot of that stuff's been working. We've worked through it, and then ultimately now we can finally perform and really make some great stuff happen.
Right, and the reality is that that cycle may happen 12 or 15 times within a long project. I mean, that's not
Over
just
and over.
yeah. It's going to happen, especially as you introduce new members or you remove members. It's going to happen. It's just people need to. It's no different than any good communication processes. You know, son of a gun, I didn't like this. Would this happen? It gets addressed quickly. We figure it out. We address it, and then when people are working together, they will go through that multiple times. Now the trust will build more and more as the team goes along.
Right.
But you know that's and the last bit I would say above all this is leaders need to develop a way to communicate this daily. And what I mean by that, I've mentioned in the last time we talked, is if leaders don't somehow demonstrate this in the work that they do, and I'm talking top leadership, and there's research that shows this. Top leadership has an influence on the effectiveness of the organization because people are smart enough to say, you know, Jim and Al aren't getting along very well. We know it. We see them. We hear about their teams. Why the hell should I work together if those guys can't do it? And that doesn't mean they're always going to agree, and it won't mean that there isn't some hardship along the way. But solving issues quickly and working with together at the top of the organization, it's just a fundamental of human nature. People are watching their leaders and what their leaders do, and if they don't do that well, it definitely has a long term impact. So the overall, I would say with all this intra-organizationally, and there's more to be done on this. Clearly, I mean, there's a lot of action behind each one of these points. Is that bringing people together takes effort. It does not happen without some strenuous, sweat-bearing effort. It takes hard work and it takes persistence as well.
Well, I think you've said it a few times during our time together here about how it's not some mantra on the wall, and and I know you've spent a lot of time in manufacturing. So how many signs have you seen of the poster where it says there's no I in teamwork? How
Oh,
many of those?
people laugh at that stuff because
Right.
I mean, these are things that you use in kindergarten. I'm not even sure if the kindergartners quite get that, but I see stuff like that all the time out on LinkedIn. It's like, yeah, we know all about, but it becomes cliche, it becomes silly, and then it loses. I mean, clearly we know there's a value in that statement, but it needs to be done at the executive level.
Well, people need to see it, not just read it,
Yeah,
right? They got to see it demonstrated every single day.
and that's
And
not easy. That's
and
not
to your,
easy at all.
and to your point about how people just know, I still remember. I mean, I was with the chief operating officer in a meeting, company years and years ago, and there was some issue that got brought up that impacted another department, and the chief operating officer says, "Oh, yeah, well, let me go talk to John or whatever his name was. I have a really good relationship, and I'll get this addressed." And everybody in the room, I mean, we just looked at each other because everybody knew that they hated each other,
Right,
right? Right? Like,
right.
I mean, this is just silliness, but that's yeah, and
But,
it, not a
but
secret. No, I mean, and it wasn't like two people knew; everybody knew, right?
yeah, and it's because this stuff gets out on the grapevine for sure. So I'm pretty much at this point. I've covered the primary areas I was going to cover today, Al.
Mike, Jim, this is great. I'm just, I'm really looking forward to you working with you as we move forward on this initiative. Obviously, um, it's my personal opinion that it's actually the bigger issue. I've told this story. I think you've probably heard it before, but I'll do it really quick. Is I was in front of 500 state tax collectors and asked them where their sources of conflict came from, and I just assumed it would be in dealing with their clients. Right out, they're out collecting taxes and
Yeah.
shutting businesses down and putting yellow tape around businesses that weren't paying their taxes and getting the police to show up and on and on and on. And 500 people, I asked them the question. I said, okay, source of contact. You got your clients who you're trying to collect taxes from. You got your employees, right? That you're because most of these people are managers, right? You got between departments and well, I don't know, everybody. It's hard to tell if everybody raised their hand, but a large majority raised their hand and said it was the between department conflict was their greatest source,
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah.
right?
There was a guy years ago on the Harvard Business Review article. I can't remember his name, but they wrote an article called the white space between the groups, and that was the big area where all of a sudden, Al's got this thing that he's doing great in legal, but fails to hand it off to HR properly, and that kind of handoff stuff is critical. I do want to mention. You said it was okay. I do want to mention my latest book on the subject that we're talking about, which is called "If Your Water Cooler Could Talk." And that is about how employees see their organizations working together. It's the employee viewpoint of whether or not we know where we're going. Can we work together? Do we communicate? Are we held accountable for the work we do? And are we persistent together as opposed to just focusing on the individual? So you can get that on Amazon.
Yeah, and Jim, I'll put that link in the show notes for this. But
Okay.
otherwise, if obviously people know how to get a hold of me, but if somebody that's listening wanted to talk directly to you or interact with you, how would they do that?
Best way to go to my drjimbone.com website, and there's a place on there where you can contact me through there.
Perfect. Yep. And you have 4 books, and I'm assuming I don't know how many Dr. Jim Bones there are on Amazon, but do you know if they put in Dr. Jim Bone on Amazon, do your books pop up?
It may be Jim Bone PhD. I'm not sure, but yeah, you can follow me out there. There's, in fact, and at the bottom of the email that I will send you, you can see my author site on Amazon.
Oh, there we go. Oh, cool. I'll include that too. Yeah, sometimes there's not many Alan Olschlagers, so right, but yeah, sometimes there is a Max Olschlager that's written a bunch of books on some completely different area, so he pops up. Um, I think I'm not sure where he's from, but Max Olschlager, big guy out there with the same spelling with my last name.
Well, I'll tell you what,
Anyway,
it's an unforgettable name. I find it just absolutely fun to say. It's great.
well, it fun to say in when you're living in Wisconsin, but I'll tell you, I've been in Philadelphia, Toronto, Seattle, other parts of the country. They just roll their eyes. But yeah, Wisconsinites, we have a big German population here, and people
Yep,
get the basics of how a German word is said.
you bet.
Yeah.
Well, thank you,
So,
thank you for the opportunity. I enjoyed this.
thank you so much, and we'll hopefully maybe talk again soon.
I look forward to it.
Take care. Bye bye.
You too, sir.
Well, that wraps up another episode of Confidence in Conflict. As you just heard, Jim is a wealth of knowledge about intraorganizational conflict, change management, and leadership. So if you want to learn more from Jim, be sure to check out his books on Amazon, and there's a link in the show notes. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want more expert advice on how to prevent and better manage conflict, subscribe to this podcast at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like this episode, please write us a review. Also, visit vistalar.com/blog to get notes for this show, share your comments, and access additional conflict management resources. Take care and stay safe.